The man who had designed most of Zoa City's housing allocation system was sitting 3 seats down from Leon when the planning session began, and Leon had spent a considerable amount of time the night before thinking about how to be in a room with him. His name was Victor Wren. 61 years old, former head of urban development, now sitting as a senior advisor to the planning authority with the particular quiet authority of someone whose ideas had been built into the physical fabric of the city around him. He had spent 30 years designing a housing system that, at the time of every single decision he had made within it, had been considered thoughtful, forward-looking, and genuinely good for Zoa City. Leon had nothing personal against Victor Wren. That was the complicated part. What he had was a folder full of evidence that 30 years of good decisions had produced a bad outcome. And the man who had made most of those decisions was going to be in the room when Leon explained that. The session met on a Wednesday morning in the Planning Authority's main conference room. 12 people around the table. Leon at one end with his data. Department heads from housing, infrastructure, education, and economic development. 2 members of the Infrastructure Council. Victor Wren 3 seats down, a notepad in front of him, his expression giving nothing away in either direction. Leon had decided the night before that he was not going to begin with numbers. He began with a man named Calvin Dubois. Calvin was 34 years old. He had grown up in Zoa City, gone to school here, trained as a structural engineer, and spent 6 years working on city infrastructure projects. He had, by any reasonable measure, been exactly the kind of person Zoa City needed to keep. He had tried to buy a home in the Eastern District, where he had grown up, 2 years ago. The entry-level properties that were priced at roughly 3.5 times what his income, combined with a partner's income, could support under any lending structure available to them. He had looked at 4 other districts. The numbers were similar everywhere within a reasonable distance of where his work was based. Calvin Dubois had left Zoa City 14 months ago. He now lived in a smaller settlement 3 hours away and commuted back into the city twice a week for projects that still required his presence. Leon let that sit for a moment. Then he told the room that Calvin was not unusual. That his folder contained variants of the same story repeated across hundreds of documented cases and implied across thousands of undocumented ones. Not people who had failed to succeed in Zoa City. People who had succeeded entirely, done everything right, built exactly the kind of life the city needed them to build, and then found that the city's housing market had no room for them at the point where they needed it most. The question he asked next was the one he had spent 4 years working toward. He asked the room how that had happened. Not rhetorically. As a genuine question that he then spent the next hour answering, because the answer was not simple and the answer was not comfortable and the answer did not have a villain in it, which made it in some ways harder to hear than a story with a villain would have been. The housing system Victor Wren had designed in the early years of Zoa City's development had been built on a principle that was, at the time, genuinely innovative. Rather than allowing the housing market to develop purely through private investment, the city had implemented an allocation framework that guided development toward specific zones, maintained quality standards across all new construction, and used a tiered pricing model intended to keep a range of housing accessible at different income levels. It had worked. For a long time it had worked very well. The problem was that the framework had been designed for the city as it existed when it was built. And the city had changed. Leon walked them through it the way you walk someone through a map, pointing to the decisions one at a time, each one making sense in isolation. The quality standards had been raised 3 times over 30 years, each time in response to legitimate concerns about construction safety and livability. Each raise had increased the baseline cost of new housing. The zoning allocations had been adjusted twice in response to infrastructure capacity concerns, both times reasonable responses to real constraints. Each adjustment had reduced the total volume of new housing that could enter the market in high-demand areas. The tiered pricing model had not been revisited in 11 years, during which time the city's economy had grown significantly, pushing the income levels of established residents upward while the pricing tiers stayed fixed, gradually pulling the affordable tiers further and further from where the market actually was. 30 years. Dozens of decisions. Every single one made by people who were paying attention to the specific problem in front of them at the time they made it. Nobody had been watching all of them simultaneously. Nobody had a model that could show what they looked like together, accumulating, compounding, quietly building a structure that worked beautifully for the people already inside it and was becoming, year by year, harder to enter for anyone who wasn't. Victor Wren had not said anything for the first hour. When he finally spoke, he did not defend himself. Leon had expected some defense, some qualification, some instinct toward protecting the decisions he had made. What he got instead was something that stayed with him for a long time after that room had emptied. Victor said he remembered the meeting where the second zoning adjustment had been made. He said he had been the person who proposed it, that the infrastructure data at the time had been clear, that the adjustment had been the right call for that specific problem on that specific day. He said he also remembered thinking, at the time, that someone should probably model the downstream effects of the adjustment against the existing allocation framework. He said that had not happened, not because anyone had decided not to do it, but because the modeling tools available at the time would have taken months and the infrastructure problem needed a decision in weeks, and so the decision had been made with the information that was present and the downstream modeling had been placed on a list of follow-up actions that had not been followed up on. He said he was not sure what that made him. The room was quiet for a moment. Leon said it made him someone who had been working with incomplete information under time pressure, which was the condition under which most of the decisions in that room had been made. He said he was not in that room to assign responsibility. He was in that room because the system those decisions had built now needed to be changed, and changing it had its own set of problems that he wanted everyone to understand before anyone started talking about solutions. The problem with dismantling the housing framework was not technical. It was not even primarily political, though the politics of it were real and would need to be managed carefully. The deepest problem was something more human than either of those things. The people who currently owned property inside Zoa City's housing framework had built their lives around what that framework had given them. Their homes were not just places to live. They were financial stability, retirement security, the accumulated result of years of work and planning and careful decision-making. The value of those homes existed in direct relationship to the conditions the framework had created. Change those conditions, reopen the market, bring new supply in at scales that the framework had been suppressing for years, and you did not just help the people who were locked out. You also changed the ground beneath the people who were locked in. Not collapsed. Not destroyed. But changed. And changed in ways that were difficult to predict precisely and impossible to guarantee would be comfortable. Leon put that on the table plainly because he believed that the people in that room needed to hold both realities at the same time. The families who could not get in. The families who were already inside and had organized their lives around the assumption that inside meant something stable. A housing system that fixed the first problem by breaking the second one was not a solution. It was a transfer of pain from one group of people to another, and it was the kind of thing that looked like progress on paper while creating the kind of human damage that didn't show up in the data for years. The head of the housing department, a man named Gil Torres who had been listening without expression for the better part of 2 hours, asked the question that the room had been building toward. He asked what changing the framework without breaking the people inside it actually required. Leon said it required doing something the city's planning processes had historically been poor at. It required thinking about decisions not in terms of the problem they solved today but in terms of what they built over time, what they combined with, what they became when you added them to everything else happening simultaneously in the same system. He said it required, in other words, exactly what the city had not done when it built the problem it was now trying to fix. The session ran for most of the day. By the time the room began to empty in the late afternoon, no solution had been agreed on. No plan had been drafted. What had happened was more preliminary than that and also, in Leon's judgment, more important. 12 people had spent a day looking at a problem without flinching from its full shape, without reaching for a simple answer, without finding a villain to organize their response around. They had sat with the discomfort of a problem that had no clean edge and no obvious starting point and no guarantee that whatever they tried would not create new problems alongside the ones it solved. That was not nothing. Victor Wren was one of the last to leave. He stopped beside Leon at the door and told him that the modeling tools available now were considerably more sophisticated than the ones available when he had been making the decisions he had made. He said that if Leon's team built a comprehensive simulation of the framework, current and proposed, he would like to review it before any restructuring plan went to the council. Leon said he would make sure that happened. Victor nodded and left. Leon stood in the emptying room for a moment, looking at the screens where his data was still displayed, the outflow numbers and the school closures and the story of Calvin Dubois sitting quietly in the afternoon light. The problem was fully in the open now. Everyone who needed to see it had seen it. What came next was the part that had never been done before. Gil Torres called Leon at 7 the following morning. He said he had been awake since 4 thinking about one specific element of what Leon had presented, a detail in the pricing tier data that he believed pointed toward a place where the framework could be restructured without destabilizing the existing ownership base, if the sequencing was right and the timeline was long enough. He said he needed Leon to come in and look at it with him before he took it any further. Leon got in his car and drove to the planning authority in the early morning quiet of a city that was still losing people while the people trying to stop it had finally, after 4 years, started working in the same direction.